Hi everybody and welcome to week 4 of the UDL Chat.ie Summer Book Club. The book that we're reading is Universal Design for Learning, Theory and Practice, and you can download a free multimedia version of the book on the cast.org website. The chapter I'm talking about today is chapter 4, Universal Design for Learning, the Principles. Really nice chapter because it's pulling together everything that we've read and talked about in the previous 3 chapters. So in those previous 3 chapters, the strategies that I used were strategies for multiple means of representation. So in addition to this video and you using the book, I also put up something else, whether it was the PowerPoint, the categorization, or my mind mapping. This week, I actually am moving from representation to multiple means of engagement for myself as I went through the chapter, and strategies that you might like to use as you are going through it as well. So the first one that I did was I actually revisited the CAST UDL guidelines, you know, the interactive one that they have up on their website, so that I could click into a principle or click into a checkpoint and just refresh myself on what that checkpoint or what that principle is all about in the context of the fresh perspective and the new perspective that I'm bringing based on the reading that I have been doing. And because it's been a while since I've gone into them, and when I first approached them, I was at that newness or the beginning of my learning journey, my learning continuum. So it was good to dip in now that I have progressed a little bit from that. Also, I watched all of the videos in this chapter because, again, they were giving me a fresh perspective. They were giving me other people's ideas and other people's examples of how these work. And I also found a video on understood.org called Seeing UDL in Action in the Classroom. It's about 10 minutes, I think. It's really, really good. And I'm going to put the link for that video up at the underneath this on YouTube. I recommend watching it at the end because, like this chapter is tying the first 3 chapters together, this tied this chapter together really nicely in a practical application. So yeah, do have a look at that. So to begin the chapter, the authors are really emphasizing the diversity and the variability and how the principles are geared towards supporting and working and optimizing diversity and variability. And they say that optimizing diversity it's a no-brainer. It's really the way we have to go, and that schools should be more about diversification and less about standardization and less about that average, that mythical average that we talked about earlier. There should be more things going on. There should be more ways to learn and more ways to teach. And if we do all of that, that's actually going to bring with it more possibilities within the school, within the classrooms, for the learners and for the teachers. So in addition to the optimizing diversity, it's also about the networks and the networking that we talked about in previous chapters as well. That social interaction of learning and remembering that we don't learn in isolation. So the context and the environment and the curriculum all influence the students' learning and influences our teaching. But also the students' learning influences the context and the curriculum, and to bear that in mind and that interaction between all of that. And also the distributed intelligence, because we're all in this together. All of the students are part of this learning community, and we as the teachers and educators are part of that learning community as well. And if we bring all the special and unique characteristics of students together, that we will learn from each other and there will be that overlap. And by developing the strengths and the characteristics of that one student, we're actually positively impacting the development of the strengths and the learning of everybody else in that community. So how to do this? Stop standardizing and start personalizing. Love that statement in the book. And what they're saying is that we need to stop teaching to the green. We need to stop teaching to that mythical average and remember that there is a kaleidoscope of colours in our classroom. Now, they're not saying that to do this, that we need to have an IEP or a learning plan for every student. We're not taking every student case by case and putting a plan in place. What it means is putting the learning and the learner first. So before everything else, before the standard curriculum, before the external pressures, public opinion, all of these different things, the learning and the learner comes first. And in doing that, we're remembering variability and remembering that education and learning is a journey, and that it is about that curiosity and that love of learning, as well as the mastery of the skills and the knowledge that we do need, but as part of that journey to being an expert learner. And in doing that, we remember that the variability can be predicted. And we talked about this in previous chapters where they used the phrase predictable normal variability. That in a classroom across our population, that we can predict the variability to them for the most part for our learners, and therefore we can plan for that expected variability. But also remembering that variability isn't about grouping our students together and customizing learning. So it isn't about putting all of our students with autism into one group and saying this is how they learn, so this is how we'll teach them, putting all of our students with GLD together, general learning disabilities, dyslexia, or gifted and talented or creative. It's not about doing that, because by doing that, you are actually excluding other people that might very well use a strategy that we've only put in place for one cohort. So it's about putting the strategies, the options in place for everyone across the board, and not labeling or categorizing anyone into one group. This is how they, so this is what we will do. It's not about that at all. Excuse me, my hay fever is really bad today. So to do that, it is a shift in mindset. And that's what UDL is. It's a shifting mindset, and it's not a strategy. So don't be thinking about it as, okay, so this is a strategy. So like differentiation or ABA or any of the reading programs out there. They're specific strategies for specific things. This is not like that. This is about shifting our understanding of how everyone learns, and going back to the theme of the expert learner in chapter 2. And that if we shift this understanding and we think about how every student learns, then we can actually use the strategies that work for them that we may have already been using. So one that comes to mind for me when I was doing this in a school was they were using tic-tac-toe, but they were only putting in the obvious choices in the tic-tac-toe. And we know tic-tac-toe is a strategy that is used as part of differentiation. So they were like, oh, do we need to throw out the tic-tac-toe? No, you don't. But let's look at exploring how we can use the tic-tac-toe. So they used it actually in English for Romeo and Juliet. They extended the boxes and they put in all of those invisible or those implicit demands on the student that we talked about in previous weeks. They put all of the options to address those and to work with those into the tic-tac-toe as well, so that it meant that students were being scaffolded throughout, but also had those options of using different ways to engage with the material and the content, and obviously different ways then to express their understanding and their knowledge, and using the tic-tac-toe to plan all of that, so to become strategic. So that's something that's used an awful lot in differentiation. No need to throw it out, because if that's the strategy that works for some students, put it in there, use it for giving them their options, and it falls within the UDL mindset. So before going into the principles, the authors really went through what universal design for learning is, and they broke it down into defining the 3 words. So I'm just going to read these from my notes on the side, and I'll put them up. I'll share the resource and I'll write them out for you. So for universal, they're saying that it's every learner, not that mythical average student. It's every learner. Design is intentional, purposeful and planned. Variability is an absolute given. That good design minimizes retrofitting. Really, really important. In the end, it's going to reduce the work of all of the learners. And then learning, every learner is challenged and supported in meaningful ways to become expert learners. Remove unnecessary barriers and provide appropriate challenge. So just as we're going through the principles, just bear in mind those definitions of what universal design for learning means for the authors here and for the people in CAST and the UDL community. So just going into the principles then, we know from last week's science chapter, wonderful chapter, that the principles are based on how the brain learns, and how the brain learns for each person is different. And if you remember last week, we talked about the effect of the recognition and the strategic networks. And what the principles really are they are the translation of that research and that learning into a practice guideline for us as teachers and educators who are looking for something that is genuinely inclusive for all of our learners. Now, to be honest, I would have liked the following principle explanations to actually follow the network explanations of last week in chapter 3. As even though I know the principles and I knew them reading chapter 3, but the networks made much more sense to me after reading the explanations on the individual principles in this chapter. But on the other hand, I guess that the knowledge development and the continuum, the learning continuum, is actually evidence here that it is actually building on the prior knowledge. So I took everything from the previous chapters and bore all of that in mind as I was reading this. So I suppose it is 2 halves of the same coin, really. So the purpose of the guidelines are developed to guide our design and our selection and application of learning tools, methods and environments. So the strategies, the context and the media that we have been speaking about over the last 3 weeks. And just remembering that we start with high standards for everyone. So it is not about saying, okay, student A is here and we're going to bring them to here. It's about student A is here and we are going to support them to be the best they can be. And there's always going to be that high standard for everyone. So again, not defining our students by the labels that have been attached to them. So they have this, so they can't do this, or they won't get this far. It's about putting in that high bar for them, considering who they are, what their strengths, their talents, their preferences and their weaknesses are. And that's really, really important. And that goes back to this personalizing. And if we put the variability and the flexibility into the design, then we are personalizing so that they can be challenged. And that's the second part of this. It's about applying that flexibility and choice to ensure that the students find the appropriate learning challenges and supports for them, and that we are ensuring that they are there for every student who is in front of us in that classroom or that learning environment. So moving into the principles themselves, the first one we know is engagement. And going back to last week, that is the effective network. It's the why of learning, and it's how students will engage with the context or the curriculum, the media, the task, whatever it is that you were doing. And what I found, and I said it last week, that I sometimes find it difficult to put engagement into words. And it really clicked with me this week. It's because engagement is so interwoven with the other two principles of representation and action and expression that it's actually hard to pull it out sometimes into its own language, or to silo it, and that's a good thing, I think. Is that if we can see actually that representation and action and expression are actually all about the engagement, and we did say very early on in book club that these three overlap. So again, the distributed intelligence, so the distributed specialization of each principle with that overlap, and that actually became quite evident for me here in this chapter. So it comes down to all three being about engaging our students in meaningful learning and enabling every student to find a way in to whatever it is, whatever context that we are working on at the time, but not only to find the way in, but to remain in through the easy and the challenging times. And that's where the options and the flexibility are really going to come to the fore, is in those challenging times, and then being able to persist and be resilient, and to stay in and to stay curious about what is happening in the learning community. So it's about that good design of learning context that offers the flexibility for that engagement. Going back, I said, to the tic-tac-toe, if there's enough flexibility and choices in that it can be used to keep the students hooked when something is challenging. And it's also a way of allowing them to become strategic, which option within that tic-tac-toe is going to work for which part of this task that they are doing. And it's again about being specific. Be specific about your goal. So your long-term goal and what you were working on in the immediacy. Okay, and we talked about the writing versus the expressive language. So if you were asking a student to write a short story, what is the purpose of that goal? Is it their expressive language, their structuring of the story, the content, creativity, or is it the function of writing? And you need to decide what it is. And if it is that expressive language, creativity, structuring, then there is a better way for those students who are challenged with writing to be able to develop those skills that you are actually aiming towards. And when you need to then focus on developing their writing, you actually design a task or design a goal that just has that in mind. So they're not trying to do both, and therefore one is actually is counteracting the other. So the student may be so creative, have this fantastic story in their head, but because they are so focused on getting those letters out and those words out, that they will write less, that it may not come out structured the way that they want it, and therefore we are not seeing their real competency levels. So really important to keep that in mind. Be specific. And remembering then that the strategies that we offer have advantages and disadvantages. And I spoke about this myself when I did the PowerPoint in week 2, that the PowerPoint for me actually, its advantages are in my representation. It's another way of putting things out to learners, but actually its disadvantages for me was in my own engagement, because I wasn't processing what I was saying. What I was writing, what I was preparing. So I actually had to double up, go back to my writing notes, and then do my PowerPoint afterwards. So, but somebody else could be typing into their PowerPoint as they're reading the chapter and processing really well. So that's it. Remembering strategies have advantages and disadvantages, and that's why students choose different strategies at different times and for different tasks. And that if given the time to learn how they learn, students will understand their own strengths and their own challenges and their own preferences. And again, that goes back to the advantages, disadvantages, what will work and what won't work, and perhaps what they have seen working for someone else and they would like to build their strength in that area. And remembering then that once the students have actually learned how they learn and understanding these strengths and challenges and preferences, that strategies can be offered to strengthen their strengths, but also to work on their weaknesses. And people often ask, okay, so writing is a weakness and you're allowing them to do it all orally, so are you not just giving them a crutch? Are you not just ignoring the challenge that they have? It's not about that at all. It's actually about bypassing strategies, and there's a video on page 52 and it talks about these strategies as bypass strategies, that they're not a crutch or they're not a reasonable accommodation, and that it's actually just being clever. And in the book, they talk about the tennis player who has a really strong front serve. So they develop that because that is their strength. But some of their opponents may have a really good backhand. So even though they are making sure that their strength is at the best it can be, they are still going to work on that backhand, so that they can develop that and they can strengthen that. So they're not ignoring the weakness. They're just making sure that their strength is really strong to keep them going while they are developing that challenge as well. Excuse me. And if we go back to the writing versus the expressive language, and if we think about our students, we give them laptops so that they can type out their all of their work, and we call that a reasonable accommodation. But actually it isn't. When you think about it in terms of UDL, this is actually their strategy for letting us know just how capable and how competent and how bright that they are. And it is allowing them to express themselves and for us to see that creativity and see all of these good things, all of these strengths that they have. So even the language that we use there kind of turns the strategy into something that isn't a good thing. And we often see in schools, particularly when students move to post-primary school, that they start rebelling against the laptop because it is something different to other students. When you look in schools that have class sets of laptops or who are digital schools, that actually has become a strategy for every student to choose. And some students may actually choose at times that they don't want to use the digital technology and they are going to do the handwriting. I'm one of those people. I will still go back to the pen and paper every time for my processing. In terms of all of that, there was a lovely quote, and bear with me, I'm just going to find it. It was on page 52. And what the quote is saying is that UDL facilitates bypass strategies for us to be and for our students to be the best that they can be, while also working on building those strategies in the weaknesses that I just talked about. And the quote here, I love it. So just think about one of those students you have in the class who just isn't confident, is always struggling, and think if they came in after being given options of strategies and they said this to you: I can live with those things, and those things being their weaknesses, so I can live with those things because I know that's not all that I am. And I just love that, because by building on their strengths, we are telling them that they are more than that disability or that label or that weakness that has been put upon them, that they are carrying around with them, and that they can shine in other areas. So that is the principle of engagement. In the Dig Deeper section of the book, they do give examples of multiple means of engagement, so you might like to go in and have a look at those as well. Moving on to representation. So the principle of representation is the recognition network that we talked about last week, and it's the what of learning and how students will perceive the content that you represent to them. So you thinking about how will you represent the content. And again, I talked about these three principles all being interwoven together and overlapping. And multiple means of representation is about increasing engagement, and that's obvious, isn't it, when you really think about it, because it's about how to reach and how to engage and how to motivate our students in their learning in the long term and also in the task at hand. And it's about developing, so after we have reached them, it's about developing their capacity to be able to perceive and interpret and understand and to engage with the information. Well, and it all comes down then to the media and the methods that we use to present it. So I'm presenting this book through videos, but as I said, each week I gave the other options. So it is those options. Does everything have to be in text? Can it be in storyboards? Are we putting up the visual signs to help students interpret the language? Are we considering the diversity of languages, whether we have multiple languages within the group of learners, whether we have variable stages of language development within our learners? Are we thinking about all of those different things? And this brings us back to that predictable variation, because what the book is telling us is that multiple means of representation can actually be broken down into three broad options for representation. And they are the options for perception, the options for language, mathematical expressions and signs, and the options for comprehension. And when you actually say it that way, it does all make sense. How are they perceiving everything? How are they comprehending everything? And how are they interpreting and understanding the language that we are using? And the fact that they've put the mathematical expressions and signs in there with language really show that variability, but also the predictability. So if you can have these three broad options, that you have a 99% chance that you are reaching everyone in that student. We did talk earlier about our students with most complex learning needs, and you still do need to have your IEP or your student support file for those students. So thinking about those three options, you need to be thinking about the learning context and the environment, and that if you are designing your learning context and your environment with these three options, that you are presenting fewer barriers regardless of that variability of students, but you're also providing rich fields of exploration. And this is what I really liked about the understood.org video that I was telling you about, because the teacher in that has actually divided his classroom up to meet these three options. And I'm not going to go into it, but you'll see it in the video, and it's just so good. And it shows how accessible and easy it is for you as a teacher to design this way, and therefore making it accessible and easy for the students in turn. And again, if you think back to the Rubik's Cube that we talked about in chapter 2, and if you talk about the design, are you going to design 2 or 3 different types of Rubik's Cube, or are you going to design that one Rubik's Cube that every learner in the environment can use? Thinking about our textbooks, the language may not be accessible to everyone. Are we just going to give them the textbook? Are we going to provide a glossary? Is that glossary going to be in a number of different languages, or can the students actually use a dictionary, whether it's a paper one or an online one, to translate the words for them? And will there be visual signposts for them as well? And then thinking about all of that, think about the appropriate scaffolding. So you don't want to overload on the scaffolding. Think about what is appropriate. So when you are thinking about variability, thinking about scaffolding students so that they can actually find some of this themselves. So if you've got 3 languages in your classroom, for example, do you need to translate those words, those big words in your textbook, into all of those different languages? Or do you teach the students that strategy to go find the word themselves? So that's the difference between giving a strategy to focus on their strengths and giving a strategy that is also building up on those weaknesses as well. So the only other thing that we need to remember here is that, like the strategies, there's no optimal medium for every student or every subject even. So it's not, even with our strategies, it's not a one size fits all. And just remembering that, for me, I put my toolkit of strategies together, but I would normally have no more than 4, maybe 5 options in a given task for students, because too many options actually is going to overwhelm them as well. And absolutely, if you're teaching a different subject, and like primary teachers, you're teaching every subject. Post-primary teachers, you could have 2 to 3 subjects. You could be teaching short courses. Some strategies will lend themselves better to some subjects than others, and just then remembering the variability of the student within that. And then finally remembering that variability derives from the context, and we can create barriers. That context can create barriers. And we talked about that in chapter 1 when we talked about, does the context or the curriculum turn a learner's characteristics into an impediment or into a strength? And we just have to think about that. And David Rose, as you know, David Rose is one of the creators of UDL and the authors of this book. He's a lovely video on page, just check here, on page 54. And it is about this idea of disability being contextual, and about us all having our own dysfunctions. I liked that, parts of us just don't work as well as we might like them to work. So his video is actually about singing, and he is talking about his wife who has a pitch perfect voice and can recognize a note just by hearing it. And pretty much David is tone deaf but happy to sing at his not pitch perfect voice. So in one context, he has the disability in not being pitch perfect, that his wife can recognize all these beautiful notes, can sing all of these beautiful notes, that he can't. But when they go to church, where his wife is the only one who is pitch perfect, she has the disability because she doesn't actually sing along with all of these other really happy people who are singing at all different notes, but are enjoying the singing and are engaged in the singing. But she isn't, because she has the distraction of all of these different notes. She doesn't sing. So therefore she has the disability or the dysfunction in that context. Watch it actually as he's telling the story. It is really, really funny, and really makes sense when you think of it that way. What are our strengths and in what contexts, and what are our own weaknesses and in what contexts? And like, really for me, it was like remembering that a weakness is only a weakness in certain contexts, and therefore I don't need to identify myself by that weakness. And going back to that quote that I said, I can live with those things because I know that's not all that I am. So moving on then to the final principle, which is action and expression. And this is the strategic network from last week, and it's the how of learning. So how will students act on their learning? What will you put in place to support them demonstrate their knowledge and their skills, but also to come up with that strategic plan to achieve it? So it is supporting the development of the executive and the strategic functioning that we spoke about last week, but it's also providing those options for action and expression. How are they actually demonstrating to us their capacity and their competency levels so that we can further support and challenge them? The more variability in action expression means that students will be able to learn from and teach each other. And this goes back to that supporting students to learn how their brain works and how how all brains work differently, and how they learn can be different from other people who they learn. But by doing that, by allowing everyone to see everyone using their own strategies, everybody is picking up within that social environment, within that learning community. And again, it's that social interaction of learning, by developing competencies, that we are positively impacting and we're moving students along that community. So for us as teachers, it's about modeling and guiding in addition to providing the options, because we need to show the students how these options can work. We need to show the students how to reflect and how to cope if the options don't work. And we talked about this in chapter 2 as well, about as the teachers and the educators being okay with taking that risk and showing that vulnerability, that sometimes even we fail. And by showing that, we are giving our students the okay to take a risk and it not working out. But we're also giving them those reflection and those resilience and coping skills. And when I go back to engagement, when I said it's about helping the students to find a way in, but then keeping them in. And this, for me, is where this really came into play, in that strategic part. That just remembering that if we model, if we guide, if we show them how to build their resilience and how to cope, then they're going to learn those skills. And I was reading a book, Kids These Days. I was reading it as part of the Shelley Moore book club, and she really bluntly spoke about this in terms of regulation and dysregulation, and that our students, and particularly or as part of their development, so right from a very young age, or our students learn how to cope and how to respond and how to regulate by watching us, the primary adults in their lives. And as teachers and educators, outside of their parents and their family adults, we are primary adults in their lives from 9 o'clock up until 3 or 4 or 5 o'clock. And they are constantly watching us, and they are constantly mimicking us. So if they have an overreaction in the classroom and we overreact to their overreaction, we're telling them that is the way to deal with the situation or with the feelings they are feeling in any given time. And she gives, it's terrible, it's Jodie, I'm terrible for remembering authors' names, you know this about me. I'll put the book into the resources as well, but she kind of talks about this circle of trust and a circle of regulation, and where the student is and should be at, and where the adult should be at. And really, it's our responsibility for giving them those strategies to be able to plan out their next moves in terms of emotional regulation, and in this context here also in terms of their educational plan. How are they going to achieve this goal? In chapter 2, I introduced you to Mason's story. Mason, who was a very intelligent young man, but was also labelled with a learning disability, and his journey. So there are more videos on page 55 of this book that our Mason's story continued. So his reflections, different strategies that he used, and there was a really video. There's 3 videos, but the spelling technique video showed Mason using his strengths to get around his being an atrocious speller. I probably really liked that one because I'm an atrocious speller myself as well. So, but I really liked that, but there are 3 videos there for that. And then just because they are the 3 principles, just putting all of that together and enacting it, it is really simple. It is about just asking yourself, how am I going to provide multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, and multiple means of action and expression? So if you can sit yourself down and you can ask yourself those questions at the beginning of a term, at the beginning of a task or a module of work, and just as I said, like, I have my little toolkit. These are the strategies, my go-to strategies. I'm always open to more strategies. So love hearing people talk about what they are putting into their lesson plans, what strategies work for them. So please do feel free to share them. I'm also going to put up again on understood.org. They actually have a template for lesson planning. And when I say template, and I was having this conversation with a lecturer friend of mine yesterday on Universal Design for Learning, it's not about going up and pulling down a sample lesson. So somebody has done a lesson on World War II, and you pull it down and you use it as your UDL lesson. That's not going to work because, remember, we said it's contextual, and you need to be designing for the learners in front of you for it to be a good design. So what understood.org have done is they have given a template where you can put in your lesson and you can ask yourself certain questions to see, have you done this in terms of representation, engagement, and action and expression. So I will put that up as well. And please, if I say things in the video that I'm putting them up and you don't see them there, drop me a tweet, because I have a head like a sieve and I forget things if I don't do them straight away. And I'm off my holidays after this video, so I'll be putting up what I pre-planned to put up, but if I forget anything, do let me know. And then finally, going back, and I've said it a couple of times over the weeks, and I know I've said it a couple of times today, but that getting specific about the task. Ask yourself, so when you're asking yourself, how are you going to provide engagement, representation, and action and expression? Also ask yourself what you and what the goal requires. So if you're working from learning outcomes, you have your learning outcome there. What do you want from that learning outcome? What do you require? You are probably doing that learning outcome over a number of lessons. So what do you need specifically in each lesson from your students to get to the end destination of that? The beginning of this chapter started, I'm going to end here now. The beginning of this chapter, I opened it and I was so happy because I'm constantly talking about UDL in terms of Google Maps, and I ask people to take out their phones and look at all the options that Google Maps gives you, because that is an excellent example of universal design and variability and options. And the first thing I saw on the first page of this chapter was a GPS analogy. So I was so pleased to see that, because I didn't know they were using it. And it's there now, so I know I was interpreting that in a positive way. So I would ask you today, or whenever you've time, to take out your phone and open your Google Maps and look at all the options it provides you. Not just at the beginning of your journey, but through your journey. How many of you have been sitting in traffic using Google Maps or the maps on your Apple phones, and the red line comes up on your visual guide of your map, and the voice comes out and says whatever's happened, adding 15 minutes onto your journey. Do you want to stay on this route, or do you want to take another route? So it's not just about putting the options in at the beginning to get to the end. It's about being responsive and having those options. So in terms of that learning outcome is your end destination. You've put in the options at the beginning, but what options, what steps are needed throughout? And that's that little bit of scaffolding. Do it. Tell me what you think about the GPS one. It's one I really like. And just check it out and have a look and see what you think. So that is it for this week. Moving on to chapter 5. So we 5, 6 and 7, 3 more chapters to go. Have a great week, and I will talk to you soon. Okay, slán.